The hand closed on my elbow before I had my badge out of my coat. It was a good grip. Trained, economical, the thumb set into the soft place above the joint so that a turn of the wrist would move a person, whether the person agreed to be moved or not. I felt it decide something about me in the half-second it took to close. And then it turned me, and I let it because I have spent 30 years learning that the first thing you lose in a doorway is your temper, and the second thing you lose is the argument. "Wrong building, ma'am." The young man attached to the hand had a clean jaw and the kind of shoulders the Navy pays for. "Deliveries and visitors use the other entrance. Come on, this way." It was 0837 on a Tuesday in spring, and the river entrance of the Pentagon was doing what it does every morning, which is swallow several thousand people who all believe they are running late. The steps were wet from a hose. The flags along the front hung without much conviction in the still air. I had walked up those steps more times than the man holding my arm had years in the Navy, and I did not tell him so, because it was not the kind of morning where telling him would have helped. I looked at the hand and then at the face above it, and I kept my own face where I keep it, which is nowhere in particular. "My badge is in my hand, Chief," I said. I had read the rate on his sleeve without meaning to, the way you read a clock. Chief Special Warfare Operator, a SEAL then, doing a screening rotation on the pedestal line, which meant somebody had decided the building needed a harder look than usual this week and had pulled operators in to give it. "If you let go of my arm, I can show it to you." He did not let go. That was the part I noticed. A man who is unsure loosens his grip to see what you will do. A man who is certain does not, and Chief Wade Hobbs, whose name I did not yet know, was certain. "You can show it to me over here," he said, and stepped me back a pace, away from the doors, toward the pedestal, where a civilian officer in a black uniform was half standing with a look on his face that I would understand later and did not understand yet. I have been moved by stronger men than that one, in worse places, for worse reasons. I let him move me. I have found that the people who most need to be right about you will always tell you who they are in the first 30 seconds, and the only thing your dignity requires is that you still be standing when they finish. Behind Hobbs, a second operator had come off the wall, younger, a first class by his sleeve, and he had done the thing his chief had not, which was read my lanyard. I watched him read it. I watched him read it again, the way you reread a line in a book when the sentence has turned out to mean something other than what you assumed. His mouth had been opened to say something to the chief, some small joke about the line or the morning, and the sentence went out of him. He did not finish it. He looked at me the way you look at weather coming. "Chief," the first class said. It was not a warning. It was too quiet to be a warning. It was a man saying a word, because he could not yet say the rest. Hobbs did not hear him. Certainty is loud from the inside. It fills the whole room, and it leaves no space for a junior man's voice at the edge of it. The badge was still in my hand. It stayed there for a while. The line kept moving around us because a line always does. People stepped past on either side with their coffees and their badges already out, and most of them did not look, because in that building, a person being spoken to by security is the most ordinary sight there is, and the trained thing to do is to keep your eyes forward and your pace even, and let the professionals sort it out. A few looked. A woman with a briefcase slowed and then decided she did not want whatever it was and sped up again. A colonel I half recognized glanced over, did the arithmetic of the situation, and kept walking, which was the correct thing for him to do, and which I did not hold against him, because it was exactly what I would have advised a colonel to do. Del Kramer, the civilian officer at the pedestal, was the one who could not keep his eyes forward. He had been in that black uniform for a long time, long enough to have watched every kind of morning cross that apron, and something in the shape of this one had brought him half out of his chair. He did not intervene. It was not his to intervene, not yet, with a chief handling it and the chain of that unclear. But he had gone still in the particular way of a man who has recognized that a mistake is being made and is calculating how long he is permitted to let it run before it becomes his mistake too. He caught my eye for a moment across the pedestal. I gave him nothing, because giving him something would have made him choose, and I did not want to make anyone choose on those steps if I could help it. I have stood in a great many lines in 30 years. I have stood in them in the cold and in the heat, and in places where the line was the only orderly thing for 1,000 miles. I have learned that a line is a small society with its own rules, and that the fastest way to be seen as a threat inside one is to behave as though the rules do not apply to you. So I applied them. I stood where I was put. I kept my hands visible and my voice level and my face nowhere in particular. And I waited the way I have taught 100 junior people to wait, because waiting well is a skill, and most people never learn it. Rank does not travel on your face. I have known that since I was a lieutenant, and I have watched better men than Chief Hobbs forget it and pay for forgetting it. And I have watched a few of them learn, which is the only part that ever interested me. What the hand on my elbow could not see was a Navy captain. 6 months short of 30 years, with the shoulder boards and the service record and the appointment that morning on a 3 stars calendar. It could not see that the building it was so carefully guarding was a building I was there to brief, or that the men on the pedestal line that week, the operators pulled in to harden the entrance, belonged to a task force that answered, through 2 layers of headquarters, to my flag. Most of them had never seen my face. That was the nature of the work. You command people who will never recognize you on a street, and you learn not to need the recognition. And then one spring morning, a chief you have never met takes your arm on a wet set of steps, and you find out exactly how little you need it. My credentials said, Captain Adrian Cole, United States Navy. It said the office and the clearance and the access. It said, to anyone trained to read it, that I could go through those doors without an escort and into rooms Chief Hobbs would need a reason and a sponsor to enter. It said all of that in laminate and a photograph. And it said none of it to the one man on the steps who had decided he already knew. I want to be fair to him, because fairness is the only revenge I have ever found worth the money. He had the instinct right. A building like that should be guarded by people who assume the worst and check. The worst does come sometimes up a set of wet steps, wearing a coat and looking like it belongs. His error was not suspicion. His error was that he had stopped at suspicion, planted his flag there, and called it knowledge, and then he had put his hand on a stranger to enforce a thing he had not bothered to confirm. There was a folded page in my bag that changed the arithmetic of the morning, though he could not have known that either. It was a request for transfer to the retired list, effective that summer. I had carried it for a week without signing it, the way you carry a letter you mean to send and keep not sending. It meant that this was very close to the last time I would climb those steps in a uniform. It meant that whatever I chose to do with the hand on my arm, I would be choosing how to spend the very end of my authority in that building. And there is a discipline to the end of things that is different from the discipline of the middle. A woman in the middle of her career spends her capital carefully because she will need it tomorrow. A woman at the end of hers can spend it on almost anything she likes. I stood on the steps and felt how light that made me and how dangerous. And I decided, before Hobbs's certainty had even begun to crack, that I was not going to raise my voice in that doorway. Not because he did not deserve it, because I did not want my last morning on those steps to be a morning I had spent shouting. It is worth saying what the job actually was, because the word commander does a lot of work in a sentence, and most of it is misleading. I commanded a joint special operations task force, which meant that on paper I was responsible for the readiness, the employment, and the lives of several hundred people drawn from more than one service, including the community that was at that moment screening the door. In practice, it meant that I sat in rooms and made decisions with incomplete information and then owned the results of those decisions, whether the information had been my fault or not. It meant I signed things. It meant I read casualty messages first, before the families, which is a kind of knowledge no one should carry and a great many officers do. It meant that the men and women who did the actual dangerous work of the task force mostly experienced me as a voice on a net, a signature on an order, a name at the bottom of an award, and almost never as a face in a doorway. That is not a complaint. It is the design. A commander who needs to be recognized on the street has misunderstood the commander's part of the bargain, which is to be the one who carries what cannot be seen. So I had made a kind of peace, years earlier, with being invisible in exactly the way I was invisible on those steps. I had held that peace through a lieutenant at a gate who would not believe my orders were real, through a contractor at a checkpoint who addressed every question to the young man beside me, through a decade of being the quietest and often the most senior person in rooms that assumed the opposite. I had learned that the peace is not a feeling, it is a practice. You do it again each time from the beginning, and the doing of it is the whole of it. And the morning on the steps was simply one more repetition of a thing I had done 10,000 times, with the small difference that it was very near the last. The last thing Miguel Arroyo ever called me was ma'am, and he made it sound like a promise. That was 7 years earlier, in a place I will not name, on a night that ran long the way those nights do, where the clock stops meaning anything and there is only the next room and the room after it. I was a commander then, a task unit commander, which is a job that sounds like leading and is mostly listening. You sit on an operations floor under bad light with a headset pressed to one ear. And you listen to men you love move through a building toward people they have never met. And your entire body wants to be in the building with them. And the discipline of the job is that you stay in your chair and let your voice be the only part of you that goes forward. Senior Chief Arroyo led the assault element that night. I had known him since he was a first class and I was a lieutenant, which is to say I had known him long enough to hear his whole life in 3 words on a radio. When he was worried, he got slower and more polite. When he was certain, he got fast and a little funny. That night he was certain. We had spent 9 weeks together in the workup before that deployment, which is the part of the job no one puts in the stories. 9 weeks of rehearsals on a mock-up built of plywood and shipping containers, run and rerun until the assault elements could move through it in the dark with the lights off and the radios full of static that the training cell added on purpose to make the easy version hard. I ran those rehearsals from a folding chair with a headset, the same posture I would hold on the night itself, and Arroyo ran the floor, and between us we broke the plan 100 times in rehearsal so it would not break once for real. He used to come find me after, in the small hours, with 2 cups of the terrible coffee, and he would sit down without asking and tell me the 3 things he thought were still wrong with the plan. And he was right about most of them, and I fixed most of them, and the ones I could not fix we simply agreed to carry because every plan has parts you carry. He had a wife and 2 daughters, Rosa and the girls, whose school pictures he kept in a plastic sleeve in his kit, and a way of talking about them that made you understand he had done the calculation every operator does. The one where you weigh what you love against what you have chosen, and had come out the far side of it at peace. He was not reckless. That is the thing people assume about men who go into rooms, and it was the opposite of true for him. He was the most careful man I ever commanded. He went into rooms because he had decided, soberly, years before, that if someone had to, it should be someone who was careful, and he could not think of anyone more careful than himself, and in that at least he was probably right. The last thing I want you to have wrong about that night is the idea that it was chaos. It was not chaos. It was the opposite of chaos, which is what made it survivable to remember. It was procedure, executed by people who had earned the right to execute it, in an order we had agreed on in daylight so that no one would have to invent anything in the dark. That is what all the plywood was for. Chaos is what happens to units that did not spend the 9 weeks. We had spent them. 2 friendlies breathing, he said, somewhere past 0200, his voice flat and warm in my ear. We are coming to you. Stand by, ma'am. Stand by, ma'am. He said it the way you would say I have got this, or almost home, or trust me. He had called me ma'am for 11 years by then, and he had made it, over those years, into a word that meant something closer to the opposite of distance. It was the promise a man makes when he intends to walk back out of a room and hand you the people he went in to get. I stood by. That was my whole job. I stood by while the 2 hostages came out into the light, blinking, alive, wrapped in the blankets my people carried for exactly that purpose. And I felt the thing you feel that is too big to feel all at once, and so arrives in pieces over the following days. And then the net from Arroyo's element went quiet, and stayed quiet in a way that a good operations floor learns to hear the way a mother hears a change in a child's breathing 3 rooms away. He had gone back for the last room. There is always a last room. He cleared it, and it was empty of the thing we had feared, and full of the thing we had not, and Senior Chief Miguel Arroyo did not come back out of it. I have thought about the word ma'am a great deal since that night. It is a small word, and people use it carelessly, and men have used it at me as an insult often enough that I have a whole shelf of the memories. A man on a set of steps can hand it to you like a leash. But I have held a headset in both hands on a plywood desk, while the last man who ever meant it went into a room and did not come out. And I know what the word can weigh when someone decides to load it. I set the headset down very gently that night, as if it could still be hurt. 7 years later, on the steps, it was still somehow in my hands. There is a protocol for what comes after, and we followed it, because protocol is a mercy when your own judgment has gone somewhere you cannot reach it. The element brought him out. That is not always possible, and it was that night, and I have been grateful for it every day since, because there are commanders who do not get even that, who have to leave part of the accounting open forever. We did not. We brought him home. There was a ramp ceremony in the gray before dawn, the kind where everyone stands very straight, because standing straight is the only thing left that you know how to do. And I stood at the end of the line, in a wind that came off nothing and went nowhere, and I did the thing a commander does at a ramp, which is to be the still point that the grief can organize itself around. I wrote the letter to Rosa myself. I did not delegate it, though I could have, and some would have said I should have, because a commander who writes every letter by hand will run out of hand. I wrote it anyway. I told her the true things, which were that he had been careful, that he had been certain, that he had gone back for 2 people who would never know his name and had gotten them out, and that the last word I ever heard him say was a promise he kept. I did not tell her the part that was mine to carry, which was that I had been the voice that sent him, and that a voice that sends men into rooms does not get to also be the voice that is sorry, not out loud, not to a widow, because the widow does not need my sorrow added to her own. She has enough. I signed the letter and I sealed it, and I have never once reread the copy, because some pages you write to be rid of them, and rereading is a way of picking them back up. That was who I was, standing on the steps with a young man's hand on my arm. Not a woman who needed a chief to know her rank. A woman who had already learned, in the hardest available classroom, exactly what her rank was worth, and exactly what it could not buy. The ground changes the way a tide turns, which is to say not all at once, and not where you are looking. Chief Hobbs's phone buzzed against his hip, or the earpiece I had not noticed spoke into his ear. I could not tell which, and it does not matter. What matters is that his head tipped a half-degree toward it, the way a man's head does when the voice he is hearing has more rank than the situation he thought he was in. He held my arm, and he listened, and while he listened, I watched the certainty go out of him. I have seen men go gray. It is not sudden, whatever people say. It arrives in stages, like a tide deciding. First the mouth, which stops doing whatever it was doing and simply rests, slightly open. Then the eyes, which go somewhere behind themselves to run a fast and unwelcome errand through the last 2 minutes. Then the color, which does not so much drain as withdraw, pulling back from the face toward some interior room where the body keeps the blood it thinks it may suddenly need. I did not hear all of what the voice said to him. I heard enough. I heard the shape of it, which was the shape of a screening lead running the morning manifest, finding a name on it he had personally cleared, and matching that name to the woman his chief was at that moment walking backward across the apron. "Chief!" I heard that much clearly, tinny and small, leaking out of the earpiece into the quiet that had gathered around us. "The woman on the steps is Captain Cole, Task Force Commander. Stand down and step back. Now." Task Force Commander. I watched the 2 words land on him and go all the way down. At the same time, because these things never arrive alone, a lieutenant who had been waved through the line 4 minutes earlier came back through it against the flow. A young officer, dark hair pulled back regulation tight, with the roster for the morning's brief still in her hand. Lieutenant Priya Solberg, though I did not know her name yet either. She had read the roster while she waited in the line, the way you read anything to pass the time, and she had seen a name on it, and now she had seen the name's owner being handled on the steps, and the collision of those 2 facts had turned her around. She did not rush up. She stopped at a careful distance, the distance a junior officer keeps when she has recognized a name, but not a face, and does not want to be wrong out loud. She just stood there and watched to see what would happen, which is its own kind of pressure, the pressure of being witnessed by someone who is deciding what the Navy is, and crossing the lobby beyond the doors, already moving before any of it, came Lieutenant Commander Grant Marrow, my aide, at the particular near run that a dignified man permits himself when walking would be a lie. He had the inner doors open and the detail behind him, and he reached the top of the steps a little out of breath, which for Marrow was the equivalent of another man arriving in tears. "Ma'am!" He put himself at my shoulder, not quite between me and Hobbs, which was a courtesy to everyone. "They are holding the room, I'm sorry, 90 seconds later than I wanted to be." 90 seconds, it is not a long time. It is long enough to lose a career or save one, depending on whose it is. Hobbs had let go of my elbow. I do not remember the exact moment he did it. His hand, the one that had held me, hung at his side now and did not know what to do with itself. It opened and closed once, the way a hand does when it has been told a thing the rest of the man has not caught up to yet. He was standing at something that was trying to be attention and could not quite get there. Because attention is for men who are sure of the ground, and his ground had just gone out from under him in front of a lieutenant commander, a civilian officer, and a captain. He had walked backward across an apron by the arm. I have thought since about what that half-minute must have been like from inside his skin, because I try to do that with people, even the ones who have just been wrong about me, since it is the only reliable way I know to keep from becoming the thing they were. He had come to work that morning to do a hard job well. Somebody had told him the building needed a harder look, and he had taken that seriously, the way a good chief takes everything seriously. And he had decided that taking it seriously meant erring toward the worst case. And the worst case had walked up the steps in a coat with a badge not yet showing, and he had acted. Everything about it was defensible, right up until the hand, and then, in the space of one radio call, every defensible piece of it had rearranged itself into the single, indefensible fact that he had laid hands on a captain. He was not a bad man, discovering he was bad. He was a good man, discovering he had been careless, which is a worse feeling, because a bad man can tell himself a story, and a good man cannot. Marrow shifted at my shoulder, ready to make it stop, to fold the whole scene up and carry it inside where the schedule was waiting. Solberg had not moved. Kramer had come the rest of the way out of his chair, and Hobbs stood in the middle of all of it, with his color gone and his hand not knowing what to do, waiting, I think, for me to tell him how bad it was going to be. Here is the part that people always get wrong when they imagine a morning like that one. They imagine the pleasure of it. They think there must be, in the moment the tide turns and the certain man goes gray, a warm rising thing in the chest, a squaring of accounts. And I will not lie to you and say I have never felt it. I have. But it is not what was in the chest that morning. What was in the chest that morning was the awareness of how easy the next part would be and how much I would dislike myself if I enjoyed it. Because it would have been very easy. That is the squeeze, the real one, and it does not come from the enemy. It comes from your own side, from the people who love you and want to protect you and would hand you the comfortable, righteous version of justice before you had finished asking for it. "Say the word, ma'am," Marrow murmured, close, so that only I could hear him. "And this is documented before you sit down. Name, rate, unit. I will note the chief." Note chief. I knew exactly what those 3 words contained. A memo before lunch, a conversation between his officer in charge and the screening lead, a young chief's morning ending in a small windowless room explaining himself, and then a line in a file that would follow him through the next board, the next assignment, the next time some other officer read his record and decided, on the strength of a single incident report, that they already knew him. I had it in my power to hand Wade Hobbs the exact thing he had tried to hand me, which was a stranger's certainty about who he was, made permanent, filed. Del Kramer, the civilian officer, had the incident log open on the pedestal and was looking at me with the patience of a man who has watched 100 versions of this and will type whatever I tell him to type. Behind Hobbs, the first class who had read my lanyard, first stood very still, having understood before his chief did. And there is a particular misery in a junior man who saw the cliff coming and could not make his senior hear him in time. And Lieutenant Solberg was watching. That was the pressure that mattered. She was young enough that she was still learning what a captain is, still assembling the picture of the officer she wanted to be out of the ones she happened to see. And she was going to learn something from me in the next 30 seconds, whether I wished to teach it or not. She was going to learn what a captain does with a chief who has just made the worst mistake of his week. She was going to carry it for 20 years. "Note the chief," hung in the air between Marrow and me, a small offered thing, waiting for me to pick it up or leave it on the ground. I have watched what the picking up does to people over a long career, and not only to the person whose name goes in the file. It does something to the one who files it, too. I have known officers who started out generous and ended up as a kind of ledger with legs, who could tell you the exact debt every subordinate owed them, and could not tell you a single thing any of those subordinates loved. They got their one justified memo at a time. Every entry in the ledger was earned. That was the trap of it. Each act of small, filed, defensible justice felt like the responsible thing, and the sum of 10,000 of them was a person nobody wanted to go to war for. I had promised myself, somewhere around the rank of commander, that whatever else the Navy made of me, it would not make me that. It is a promise you cannot keep once. You keep it in doorways, in the ordinary chances of which this was plainly one. And there was Solberg, still watching, still deciding what a captain is. I remembered being her. I remembered the officers I had watched at her age, the ones whose example I had kept, and the ones whose example I had kept in order to do the opposite. And I remembered that I had never once learned what kind of officer to be from a lecture. I had learned it from watching what people did when they had power and a grievance in the same hand at the same time. She was about to watch me have exactly that. Whatever I did, she was going to keep. I thought of Arroyo. It is not a dramatic thing to say, and I do not mean it as one. I thought of him the way you think of a person who has become, over years, a kind of instrument you use to take your own measurements. I asked myself the question I have asked myself in every doorway since that night, which is not what do I deserve and not what does he deserve, but what would I want to have done on my last week, standing where I am standing, if the man on the plywood desk in my memory could see me do it. Arroyo had gone back into a room for two strangers who would never know his name. He had spent the last certainty of his life on people who could not have picked him out of a photograph. Set against that, the idea of spending the last authority of mine on ending a young chief for guarding a door too hard for 30 seconds was not righteous. It was small. It was the kind of small that I have watched hollow out good officers over a career. The accumulation of tiny justified cruelties, each one earned, each one defensible, until one day you are a person who is right all the time and pleasant to no one, and useful to nothing. No, nothing, I said to Marrow quietly in the voice I keep for instructions I do not intend to repeat. I will speak to the chief myself. Marrow is a good officer, which means he let exactly one beat pass, long enough to be sure he had heard me, and not one beat longer. Aye, ma'am, he said, and stepped back and took the whole apparatus of documentation back with him, and the incident log on Kramer's pedestal quietly closed. Then I turned to Hobbs, and I gave him the thing I had decided to give him, which was the truth and a way back, in the same breath, because the truth without a way back is just a punishment wearing a lecturer's clothes. I looked at him until he looked at me, which took a moment because a man who has just gone gray does not want to meet the eyes of the person who watched it happen. When he finally did, I held it. You had the instinct, right, Chief? I said. A door like this should be guarded by people who assume the worst and check. That part, you keep. I let that sit, because a correction that is only correction teaches a man nothing except to be afraid of you. And I did not want him afraid of me. I wanted him better. You had the manners wrong, you stopped at the assuming and skipped the checking, and you put your hand on a stranger to enforce a thing you had not confirmed. Learn the difference before it cost you the next one, because the next one might not be a captain who is having a generous morning. His chin came up a fraction. Not relief. Relief would have been him deciding he had gotten away with something, and I did not want that either. What came up in his face was closer to the look of a man who has been handed a debt he did not expect to be trusted with, and has decided, in the handing, to be worth it. Yes, ma'am, he said. And then, because he was a chief, and chiefs cannot help themselves. It will not happen again, ma'am. It had better happen again, I said. The stopping people part. Just do the checking first. And I almost smiled, and did not, because a captain's almost smile is worth more kept than spent. I walked through the doors I had been barred from 90 seconds earlier, and the line parted for me the way water parts without deciding to simply because something with more mass has entered it. Vice Admiral Eleanor Brandt was waiting at the inner threshold. She is a small woman with a large stillness, 3 stars and a reputation for beginning meetings exactly on time and ending them early. And she had come down from the room herself, which she did not need to do, and which told me she had heard some version of what had happened on the steps. She did not make a performance of it. She looked at me the way old colleagues look at each other, which is a way that contains a whole history in a single unremarkable glance. Captain Cole, she said, we do not start these without you. We never have. Ma'am, I said, I was detained by your security. They are thorough. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. So I hear. She turned to walk me in, and then paused and looked back past me at the steps, at Hobbs standing at his post with his spine a good deal straighter than it had been when I arrived. Anything I need to know about that? No, ma'am, I said. It is handled. She studied me for a second, the way she studies a slide she suspects has been simplified for her benefit, and then she accepted it, because part of trusting your officers is letting them handle the things they say they have handled. "Then let us not waste the room's morning," she said, and we went in. The corridor to the room was the same corridor it had always been, and I was the same person I had been on the steps, and the only thing that had changed was that now people could see it. And I noticed how little the seeing changed anything real. Staff officers stepped aside and came to the edge of attention. A commander I knew nodded and said, "Captain," with the small extra weight people give a name when they have just heard a story about it. It was pleasant. I will not pretend it was not pleasant after being walked backward across an apron, to be walked forward down a corridor by a 3-star. But I held it at arm's length, the pleasantness, the way you hold anything that could become a habit, because I have seen what the habit does. The officers who need the corridor to part for them are the same officers, exactly, who cannot survive a hand on the arm at the door, and the two things are not opposites. They are the same disease at different temperatures. The cure for both is to notice that the corridor parting and the chief's grip closing are equally about other people, and that neither one has anything to do with the part of you that is actually yours. Solberg had followed us in as far as her business allowed, and at the inner door she stopped, because that was as far as her badge went that morning, and she looked at me one more time. She was trying to work something out. I could see it, the way you can see a young officer doing arithmetic behind their eyes. I think she had expected, when the tide turned on the steps, to watch a captain collect a debt, and instead she had watched a captain forgive one, out loud, in a way that cost the captain something, and the chief nothing but the lesson. And she was trying to fit that into her picture of what power was for. I did not help her with it. Some things you have to solve yourself, or they do not stay solved. I only gave her the same nod I would give her at the outer door a minute later, the nod that says, "You saw that correctly, now carry it," and she gave me one back that told me she would. I looked back once at the doors before they closed. Not at Hobbs, or not only at him, at the whole shape of it, the wet steps and the flags and the line of people who would go through those doors that day, never knowing that anything had happened, which is how it should be, because a building runs on 10,000 small mercies that no one ever files. Solberg, the lieutenant, caught my eye for half a second as the doors swung. She gave me the smallest nod, the nod of a young officer who has just been taught something and knows it, and I gave her nothing back except the fact of walking through the door on my own 2 feet, which was the lesson anyway. The doors closed behind me, this time from the inside. The room upstairs was the kind of room the building keeps for mornings that matter, long and windowless and cooled a few degrees past comfortable so that nobody gets sleepy. The people around the table were the people who are always around that kind of table, principals and their staffs, a pair of allies at the far end, a screen on the wall with a map on it that I am not going to describe. I took my chair and I set the folded page in my bag out of my mind, or tried to, and I gave them the thing I had come to give them, which was a clear picture of what my task force could do, what it could not, and what it would cost to change either answer. That is the whole art of a brief at that level. Not persuasion, clarity. The temptation is always to make the picture prettier than it is, because the room wants good news and you want the room to like you. And the officers who give in to that temptation are the reason other officers die in rooms that were supposed to be empty. I had decided a long time ago never to be that officer, and I was not going to start being her in my last week. Vice Admiral Brandt ran the meeting the way she runs everything, which is briskly and without cruelty. And she asked me 2 hard questions and let her staff ask 3 harder ones. And I answered all 5 without dressing any of them up. Near the end, she looked at me over the top of her glasses in a way I had seen her look at people for 20 years, and she said, "You are sure?" And I said, "I am sure, ma'am, about the parts I said I was sure about, and I told you which parts those were." And she nodded, because that is the only answer she has ever respected. The decision that came out of the room was a good one. I will not tell you what it was. I will only tell you that it was made on true information, and that some number of people I will never meet are better off for the fact that nobody in that room lied to make the morning smoother. The paperwork tried to come back, the way paperwork does. By the time the brief ended, near 1100, Marrow had a message from the screening lead, the same man whose voice had leaked out of Hobbs's earpiece, and the message was that the lead intended to counsel Hobbs formally, regardless of my wishes, because from where he sat, a man on his line had laid hands on a flag officer's equivalent, and that was a training failure he owned and meant to fix in writing. I understood the impulse. It was a good impulse. It was, in fact, my own impulse, aimed the other way. and I have never trusted a leader who cannot recognize his own reflexes in another person and decline them on purpose. "Get me the screening lead," I told Marrow, and when I had him on the phone, in the corridor outside the room, I did not pull rank, because pulling rank on a man for trying to enforce discipline is a good way to teach him never to enforce it again. I told him the truth instead. "The captain he stopped is asking you to let it go," I said. "Not ordering, asking. He made a mistake, I corrected it, he took the correction like a man, and I do not want the first thing the next board reads about Chief Hobbs to be the worst 30 seconds of his week. If he makes it a habit, that is yours, and you should end it. If he made it once, in front of me, and learned it in front of me, then the lesson is already better than anything your memo can add. That is the whole report. Put my name on it if you need cover." There was a silence on the line, the silence of a senior enlisted man revising a plan he had been fond of. "Aye, Captain," he said finally. "Closed." "Closed," I agreed, and hung up and stood in the corridor for a moment with the strange lightness of having spent real capital, my own, deliberately, to protect a man who had wronged me. It is not a feeling I would recommend to anyone looking for satisfaction. It is a quieter thing than satisfaction. It is closer to the feeling of setting a headset down gently. I had done a version of it before, of course. That is the thing no one tells you about a long career, that you keep meeting the same decisions, wearing different clothes. After the night we lost Arroyo, when the after-action came due and the machine went looking, the way the machine does, for the failure that explained the death, I had sat with the awards packages for his element, and I had made a choice about how the story would be told. I refused to let his loss be written as anyone's error. Not the young operator who had been at his shoulder and replayed the last room every night for a year. Not the intelligence that had been imperfect, because all intelligence is imperfect and men still have to go through doors. I wrote it, and I made the others write it, as what it was, which was a good man spending the last of himself the way he had always intended to, on strangers, correctly. I signed those pages with the same hand I now used to close a young chief's file before it opened. There was a young operator who had been at Arroyo's shoulder in the last hour. A first class then, not much older than the one who had read my lanyard on the steps. He came back from that deployment, carrying the last room the way a person carries a stone swallowed whole. And the machine, when it went looking for its failure, put its light on him for a while, because he had been closest, and closest is where the light goes. I stood between the light and that young man with everything I had. Not because he was blameless, none of us is blameless, but because I had watched him do everything right and lose anyway. And I knew that if the Navy taught him that doing everything right and losing was a punishable offense, it would lose him too, slower, over years, to the particular rot that eats people who were made to believe a death was their arithmetic error. So I wrote him out of the blame and into the truth, which had room for both his grief and his innocence. And I promoted him when the time came. And he is a master chief now, with a reputation for being unusually gentle with his youngest people. And I would like to think some small part of that traces back to a captain who refused to file the cheap version of a hard night. That is the only kind of monument our work allows. You do not get statues, you get the people you decline to break, walking around years later being kinder than they had to be, 7 years apart, the same signature. I have come to think that is most of what a career is, if you do it right. The same signature, over and over, on the pages that decide whether the people around you get to be built or broken. You do not get many grand chances to be the officer you meant to be. You get a great many small ones in doorways and corridors and over the phone, and they all look like nothing, and they are the entire job. Marrow found me in the corridor after the call and did not say anything for a moment, which is how I knew he had something to say. He is careful with me the way good aides are careful, which is not the same as timid. "Permission to speak plainly, ma'am," he said, and I told him he had never once asked that question when he intended to speak any other way, and he almost smiled. "You could have ended him," he said. "Most captains would have. Some of them would have been right to." He was not arguing. He was trying to understand the officer he had spent 2 years serving before that service ended, so that he could carry the understanding into whatever came next for him. "Why didn't you?" I thought about how to answer him honestly, because Marrow had earned an honest answer, and because the young officer he would someday be advising had earned it too, secondhand, through him. "Because ending him would have cost me nothing," I said, "and I have spent my whole career learning to be suspicious of the things that cost me nothing. The cheap righteous move is almost always the wrong one. It feels like justice because it is easy and it lands on someone other than you. Real discipline usually costs the person handing it out something. It cost me a phone call and a little capital to keep that chief. That is roughly the correct price for a lesson that will actually take. Free lessons do not take. He would have spent the next 20 years telling himself a story about the captain who ruined his morning, and he would have learned nothing except to resent the rank he was supposed to grow into. Marrow took that in, the way he takes everything in, filing it somewhere he would find it later. Write that down if you want, I told him. You will need it in about 6 years. Inside the room, while the business of the morning went on around me, I held 2 doors in my mind at once. The way you learn to. The brief was important. I will not pretend it was not. Rooms like that one decide things that move other people toward other rooms in other countries. And I had spent a career earning the chair I sat in, and I intended to earn it that morning too. I said the things I had come to say. I answered the questions the 3-star asked and the harder ones her staff asked, and I watched a decision take shape the way weather takes shape, out of 100 small pressures, and I did my part to shape it well. And underneath all of it, in the room the body keeps for the things it cannot set down, I was standing on a plywood floor 7 years earlier with a headset in my hands. And I was standing on wet steps that morning with a young man's grip on my arm. And I was noticing, the way you notice a thing you have somehow avoided noticing for years, that the 2 moments were the same moment. Both were about a door. Both were about who gets to go through it and who decides and what it costs. A man had held my arm on the steps and been wrong about me, and it had cost me nothing. Not my morning, not my dignity, not 1 degree of the composure I keep nowhere in particular. I had walked through the door on my own feet an hour later and briefed a 3-star and closed a chief's file with a phone call. The whole insult, weighed honestly, came to nothing at all. I had held a headset while a better man went into a room and did not come out, and it had cost me everything I have spent 7 years learning to carry. That was the door that mattered. That was the one I would take home. I think that is the arithmetic that people miss when they imagine that a morning like mine is about being vindicated. Vindication is small. It is the smallest true thing in the story. It arrives, it is real, and it weighs almost nothing next to the losses a long career hands you, the men you could not reach in time, the rooms that stayed quiet, the promises loaded into a single word by someone who meant it and then did not come back to see it kept. Being right in a doorway is a light thing. It is grief that is heavy, and I have never once confused the two. And I was not about to start on a Tuesday over a chief and a set of steps. I think the confusion is common because both things arrive wearing the same clothes. An insult and a loss both start with someone deciding you can be treated a certain way, and both leave you standing very still while the world rearranges around the fact of it. But they diverge almost at once. And the difference is everything. An insult is a claim about you that you are free to decline, and the declining is entirely within your power. Which is why an insult, met correctly, cannot actually take anything from you at all. A loss is not a claim. It is a subtraction. It takes a specific person out of the specific world and hands you the remainder to carry, and there is no composure on earth that declines it, because there is nothing to decline. You do not keep your dignity in the face of grief the way you keep it in the face of a hand on your arm. You just keep breathing, and you carry the remainder, and you let it change you into someone who knows the weight of things. The chief on the steps had offered me a claim. I declined it, and it cost me nothing, and I was whole. Miguel Arroyo had left me a remainder 7 years earlier, and I had carried it every day since, and I was not whole, and I never would be. And that was the correct shape for a person who had loved him to be. I knew, sitting in that cool room, exactly which of the 2 mornings had been the real one. There was still the folded page in my bag. My thumb found the fold of it under the table without my deciding to send it there, and ran along the crease, and I understood, sitting in that room, that it was time. Not out of bitterness, the opposite. Because I had stood on the steps that morning and discovered that I no longer needed the building to know me. And a person who no longer needs the building to know her is a person who is ready to leave it, gently with the door swinging shut on its own behind her. I had been afraid of that page for a week, if I am honest, and the fear was not about the leaving. It was about who I would be on the other side of the uniform. When you have spent 30 years as a rank, there is a real question about what is left when the rank comes off. and I had watched enough people fail to answer it to take the question seriously. Some of them never take the uniform off, not really, and you meet them years later still introducing themselves by a rank the Navy stopped paying them to hold, still needing every room to know what they used to be. And it is one of the saddest things I know. A person guarding a door that closed behind them a decade ago. I did not want to be that. The morning on the steps, oddly, was the thing that told me I would not be, because I had stood there stripped of every visible sign of who I was, handled like a stranger, and I had found that the thing underneath the rank was still intact, still mine, still steady. If it could survive a chief's hand on my arm, it could survive the paperwork. That is what the steps taught me in the end, though the chief will never know he taught it. I signed the page that week, and I walked out of the building for the last time on a Friday near 1700 into the long light coming off the river. I had spent the days between clearing out a career, which is a stranger errand than anyone tells you. You would think 30 years would fill more boxes. It fills fewer. Most of it does not come off the walls at all, because most of it was never on the walls. There were 2 boxes, a folded flag from a retirement I had attended for someone else and been given a spare of by accident, a challenge coin from Arroyo's Element that I have carried in the same pocket for 7 years and did not pack because it was not office property, it was just mine. A photograph of a plywood mock-up that would mean nothing to anyone who had not spent 9 weeks failing inside it on purpose. Marrow helped me carry the 2 boxes to the car and tried to make a small speech, and I stopped him, gently, because I did not want the last thing between us to be a speech. I told him instead the one thing I actually wanted him to keep, which was that the job would try, for the rest of his life, to convince him that the big decisions were the ones that mattered, and that it would be lying, and that the whole of it was in the doorways. He said, "Aye, ma'am," and for once did not file it, just held it, which was better. The screening line was still up. It would come down the following week, when whatever had made the building want a harder look had passed, but that Friday it was still there, and Chief Hobbs was still on it, and I saw him from a distance as I came down the corridor toward the doors, and I watched him see me. He did not wait to be told this time. He did not wait for a phone to tell him who I was. He had spent the week, I think, learning my face the way you learn a thing you never want to be wrong about again. And when I came through the inner doors, he came to attention correctly, cleanly, the way a chief comes to attention when he means it and not when he is caught. He did not overdo it. There was no apology in it, which was right because the apology had already been made and taken, and the thing that was owed after that was not more apology, but simply doing it right, once, in front of the same witnesses, to close the circle. "Ma'am," he said as I passed. I stopped. It was my last minute in the building, and I could afford it. "Chief," I said, "guard it well." "I will, ma'am." And then, because he was a chief and could not help himself, and because I think he wanted me to carry it out the door with me, he said, "Thank you, for the week I got to keep." I did not tell him what it had cost me to give it to him, because it had not cost me anything, and because a gift you itemize is not a gift. I gave him a nod, the kind Solberg had given me at the doors on Tuesday, the nod that passes something down a line without any words on it, and I went out through the doors and down the wet steps into the light. I stood for a second at the bottom, at the exact place on the apron where a young man had taken my elbow 4 days earlier, certain he knew who I was, and wrong about all of it. It is a very ordinary piece of ground. Concrete, a hose stain, the flags going quietly overhead. Nothing about it tells you that anything ever happens there. 10,000 people crossed it that day, and none of them knew that a career had ended on it an hour before, or that a small mercy had been done there on Tuesday and never filed. And that is exactly as it should be. The building runs on the mercies no one files. It always has. Then I turned my back on the doors for good and went down the steps and did not look up at them again. I want to say one thing to you, whoever you are, and then I will let you go. If someone has ever put a hand on your arm and decided in the half second it took to close their grip that you were no one, then you already know the particular quiet that comes next. You know how the room narrows to that hand? You know the 2 easy roads out of it, which are to make yourself small and agree with them, or to make yourself loud and spend your whole morning proving them wrong. I have taken both roads in my life, and I can tell you that neither one gets you where you were going. Here is what I have instead, after 30 years of doorways. Your standing is not the thing that lands in someone else's hand. It is not the badge, and it is not the rank, and it is not whether the certain man on the steps ever figures out who you are. Your standing is the thing that keeps your face still while he gets it wrong. It is yours, whether he reads it or not. It was yours before he touched you, and it will be yours after he lets go. And the only power he has over it is the power you hand him by needing him to see it. So do not hand it over. Keep your face where you keep it. Let the correction be clean and the mercy be real. If you have it in you, because you will meet these people again wearing different clothes, and you will want to have been the kind of person who built them rather than broke them. And then let the door open on its own. It will. It always does. And when it does, walk through it on your own 2 feet, and do not look back at the people who kept you standing outside it, because they were never the door. They were only ever the hand, and a hand, once it lets go, is just a hand. Guard it well.